Sometimes, no matter how much you want to like a movie, you've really got no chance. A Countess from Hong Kong is the last film from Charlie Chaplin. He directed it, he wrote it, and he wrote the music. He has a brief cameo, which was his last film appearance ever. This was the only film he made in color, and I guess the only time he worked with really big international stars who weren't himself. If you don't already know who's in this movie, hopefully you're sitting down because I'm about to tell you that it stars Marlon Brando and Sophia Loren. Tippi Hedren is also there, and Patrick Cargill, and Chaplin's son, Sidney. There's also cameos from Geraldine and Josephine Chaplin. So it's a Charlie Chaplin movie made in 1967, starring Marlon Brando and Sophia Loren. How could it possibly go wrong? Or maybe the question is, how could it possibly not go wrong? Because that's kind of a strange combination of people. Let me tell you right now that if you want to see a cool later Chaplin film, go watch Monsieur Verdoux or Limelight. In both of them, you get to hear him talk and see him not look like a tramp. Those are both really interesting and really great movies. Sadly, A Countess from Hong Kong is neither of those things. It's mediocre, inconsequential, not even particularly interesting. Still, there's some things to talk about, and I guess it is rare for a director to end on a high. Can you name a single director whose last movie is actually good? Not so common. Anyway, I'll give you a sketch of why this isn't such a great movie, dig out a couple of themes from it, talk a little bit about Chaplin, then we can all go home. Maybe you're there already. First of all, let me reassure you that there is no yellowface in this movie. Sophia Loren plays a countess from Hong Kong, but she's from Russia. I don't think there's a single Asian character in the movie. There's one slightly odd line where someone says that Loren looks like a Hawaiian. The film starts out in Hong Kong, but it's stock footage Hong Kong, plus a pretty transparent Hollywood, but not Hollywood because this is a British movie, pretty transparent set. Most of this movie takes place in 2 rooms on board an ocean liner, and this ends up being a pretty big weakness of the movie. Maybe the setup could have worked, but Chaplin, as a director, fails to do some relatively simple things. For instance, he doesn't really establish that we're on a ship very well. There are very few shots of the outside of the ship, almost as if they didn't actually have a huge boat to film the movie on. We don't see the deck of the ship until more than 20 minutes into the movie. Eventually, we get a couple of shots of waves, but again, it sort of looks like stock footage. The camera rocks a little bit at one point when the seas are rougher. Okay, that's something, but for the most part, it looks like they're just in a hotel room in a building. Well, it looks like they're on a set. I know there are nice cabins and suites on ships, but they still always kind of look like they're on a ship, you know? And here, we don't have that. What we do have isn't even particularly interesting either. The set is pretty blank. And I don't bring this all up to be pedantic, but because I think all these things accumulate to make the movie feel kind of underwhelming, cheap, primitive. Still, maybe you could salvage this with some great camera work, but we sort of have the opposite. It seems like the entire movie is filmed from 1 or 2 camera positions. We almost never see the other side of these 2 rooms that we spend the whole movie in. At one point, a crew member comes by and says, "Oh, close your portholes, it's stormy out there." And you think, portholes? What portholes? You've never seen that side of the room. You've never seen that wall. You didn't even realize that there were windows here. There are a couple of reverse shots. You can see the portholes a little bit. I really was watching out for them after this, and you can catch a glimpse of them in some of these reverse shots. But not much variety. To be fair, there's not a lot you can do with just 2 rooms, especially if you care about following the old 180-degree rule. But either way, the result is that this looks like a play. Maybe you're thinking, who cares what it looks like, or who cares about the set? Isn't the question whether or not the movie is funny? And yes, that is the question. But the point is, even if this movie were funny, which it isn't, it would still have a lot of problems. It would still be staggering under the weight of a lot of issues. There's one interesting little mechanic to mention here before moving on about the set, which is the radio in the cabin. For the most part, this movie is totally kind of out of time, totally disconnected from technology. Well, there's a couple of hints of, like, the up-and-coming young crew, and there's one moment of hearing popular music that's a little jarring in the film. For the most part, we get a score, we get Chaplin's sort of sweet, romantic score, which the music, I actually think the music itself is pretty good. One of these songs was made into a bit of a radio hit. The way it's used in the movie is a little strange, but the music itself, I think, is nice. Anyway, there's a radio in the cabin, and some of the film's score actually comes through this radio. At first, you don't realize that's what's happening until someone walks over to the radio, turns it down, and the score gets quieter. Whoa, what's going on? I wouldn't really call that a joke, but it's kind of a neat trick, and it's not the first time that Chaplin has played with sound, which, of course, his relationship with sound at sometimes defined his career in his films. Let's talk about the big stars. How do they fare in the Chaplin universe? Are we even in the Chaplin universe? Well, Marlon Brando is probably one of the tensest people in history. It is a bit odd to see him in a comedy. I will say that I recently watched Mutiny on the Bounty, the one from 1962, approximately, and there are some funny scenes in that movie. There's a hilarious scene where the Captain Bligh tells him that he has to go back and romance one of the locals. Now, turns out he does, and he actually would go on to marry the actress playing one of the locals. Anyway, he gives a perfect deadpan sort of comedic performance there. So comedy's not entirely beyond Brando, I think. But how's it going to work with Chaplin? I mean, Chaplin has a particular comedic sensibility, a certain physicality. So is Brando going to do the tramp walk? I mean, no, obviously, but how are you going to sort of bring together these two different worlds? Well, the answer is that Brando is just the straight man in this movie, and in some ways, him being this really tense and grumpy guy is actually a good fit for that. He never really goes beyond this. And like I said, it kind of works. It kind of fits the story. But ultimately, for me, he's just a little too unpleasant to be at home in the movie. And the romantic plot, I didn't really buy it either, exactly. If you're looking for the tramp in the film, it's Sophia Loren's character, Natasha. She's got a title of a countess, but she's got no money and is stuck in Hong Kong until she stows away on this ocean liner. So this is a character without a home, who's down and out, but isn't afraid, who has some spunk. And that comes right out of the Chaplin playbook, and right out of his life, perhaps, too. Chaplin was disconnected from his family for most of his life. This is a British movie made after he had been exiled from his adopted home in Hollywood, and apparently inspired by a trip to Shanghai, where he encountered some of these real countesses, and where their story really resonated with him. Anyway, Sophia Loren does have charm in this movie, because, of course, and that might be the best thing about the movie. There's charm, but it's not a great comedic performance still, but she's okay. So Natasha, anyways, is hanging out in Brando's cabin, and about half of the jokes in this movie come from her having to hide when someone comes to visit, essentially. This is not a particularly sophisticated dynamic, and it's way, way overused in the film, but it is one of the places where you see an attempt at the classic Chaplin-esque physique, or physicality, maybe one of the only places, right? So someone's going to come and knock on the door, and then there's going to be a bit of a cartoonish scramble to hide, where people are going to throw their arms up, whoa, uh-oh, and go this way, go that way a little bit, almost like the Roadrunner. It's a very interesting question, by the way, to look at the overlap of some of Chaplin's live-action stuff and some cartoon things. Which way did the influence flow? Interesting question. These moments, they almost count as jokes, but not quite. I only laughed once or twice while watching the movie. I thought it was pretty funny when Brando buys Loren some clothes and they don't fit. I think that's pretty good. But I can't really remember another joke in the movie. Your mileage may vary a little bit, but I wouldn't say that this is a particularly funny movie, but that doesn't mean it's totally without virtue. And really the best thing about A Countess from Hong Kong is not the humor, it's the romance. Of course, it's an extremely one-dimensional story. You already know how it ends, more or less. But if you can stomach that kind of thing, if you like your coffee with 17 cubes of sugar, then there's something here that's kind of endearing. The movie has a lightness to it and a sweetness that is part of what you would find in a lot of Chaplin movies. Unfortunately, there's another key ingredient, I think, which we don't have, and that's darkness. It might not be as legible today, but a lot of Chaplin's movies were kind of edgy, or if not edgy, they at least combined lightness with darker things like poverty, war, precarity more generally. Like I said, there's a hint of that in Natasha here, but it gets almost completely overshadowed by the luxury and opulence everywhere else in the movie. Her life never really seems particularly in danger. It doesn't seem particularly precarious. There's one interesting plot point, actually, where Natasha is worried about how she can enter the U.S. without being a citizen and without having a passport at all. This is somewhat apropos today, and it may have been for Chaplin as well, whose re-entry permit had been torn up. People speculate that he probably could have gotten one had he wanted to return to the U.S., but he didn't. There's potential for some conflict here, for some darkness in the movie, but we skip right over it, and overall the movie has no bite. That was probably the main thing that disappointed me about it. You kind of feel like, oh man, it's his last movie. You want it to be this thing that's going to really sting in a way, or it's really going to encompass his career. It's going to have a broader scope. But this is, like I said, a pretty inconsequential film. Oh well. If you're still watching, I can tell you that I might have wasted your time by not saying what I'm about to say a bit earlier, because it kind of explains the whole movie, really. Chaplin made a Countess from Hong Kong from a script that he'd had in his pocket for a long time. Originally, he wanted to make a movie called Stowaway, starring his wife, Paulette Goddard. This would have been in the 1930s, and that makes a lot of sense, because this is really a 1930s movie that happened to be made 30 years later. This movie was a flop when it came out, and most of the criticism was that it felt dated. And I hate to say it, but I think that's completely correct. I still think this would still be somewhat middling, even if it had come out in the 1930s. I mean, unless it was, in color and such. But the movie would have been far more at home amongst kind of the screwball comedies of that era. Consider, for instance, The Lady Eve, which is even set on an ocean liner. I think that's 1941, Barbara Stanwyck. Anyway, that movie is actually probably better than this one, but they're kind of in the same ballpark. That's most of what I have to say about A Countess from Hong Kong. Like I said, I wished it were better. I could talk for a long time about the man, Chaplin himself. A couple of years ago, I read this book about him, which it's pretty decent. It mentioned a couple of interesting things about this movie, some of which I've already slipped into the video. One little detail is that film critic Penelope Gilliatt visited the set, and there's a few quotes from her about making the movie. Penelope Gilliatt sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Well, she would later go and write the movie Sunday Bloody Sunday, which I reviewed 2 weeks ago. Anyway, if you haven't perused Chaplin's Wikipedia page already or read some book about him, you should. Chaplin doesn't need any introduction, but he was a complex guy. There's a lot that people don't know about him. For decades, for generations, he was one of the most recognizable people in the world, and yet most people don't know what he looked like. They don't know what he sounded like. They don't know much about his life and the relationship between Chaplin's movies and his life and personality, both of which were pretty intense. It's fascinating, but I'll leave that for another time, and for now, I'll just say, don't bother with A Countess from Hong Kong. If you want a cool Chaplin movie, just go watch Limelight. That is a great, great film.